Hi. There we go. I was waiting for it to come up. All right. So we're going to talk some free speech today. Again, civil liberties is all of chapter 14, and the PowerPoint itself is about 120 pages long. And the First Amendment is a lot of that. So here we go. Free speech. Only through free and uncensored expression of opinion can government be kept responsive to the electorate and political power transferred peacefully. Of course, the entire point of freedom of expression or free speech, whatever you want to call it, they're essentially the same thing, is to prevent government tyranny, right? Like, I need to be able to speak freely and critically of my government in most instances in order to kind of keep them in check and in order to keep a free society. The moment that we lose freedom of expression is the moment we truly lose any sort of concept of democracy. All right, so it's kind of heavy. All right, so the deal is, though, is that you don't have an absolute right to free speech. So, as you know, I mean, just being in school, you know that you can't just run down the hall screaming F bombs at people. And then when you got in trouble, be like, no, you can't punish me. That's a violation of my First Amendment right to free speech. Well, no, it's really not. Because there are what's called time, place, and manner restrictions. So we'll get to those in a second. But so over here on the left of the spectrum, we look at this as less intervention all the way over to the right to more intervention. And it's, we have three different forms of expression, right? Your beliefs or your thoughts that are just sort of held within you. Your actual speech, so things that you say or you write down or what have you, or you post on social media or write in a publication or something like that, or even wear on on your clothing or hats, or put on your bumper stickers on your car or what have you, lawn signs, blah blah blah. And then there's actions. So what you actually do with that freedom of expression. And there tends to be less intervention or none in terms of your thoughts and beliefs. They can't punish you for your belief set, number one, because you're entitled to them. And number two, because, we don't have, we're not 1984, we don't have the thought police, right? So there's no way for the government to actually find out what you're thinking unless you express that opinion out loud. So of course we have less intervention over here. In the middle is, actual speech. And again, it's, real speech, meaning like something you're saying, and then what's called symbolic speech, which we'll get to a couple of cases on that, one that's a required case. But, again, it's more, this is why we call it freedom of expression, because you can express yourself in ways that are not just simply what you say. Again, it could be what you wear. It could be what you like lawn signs you put outside your house, or what bumper stickers you put on your car, or, what's on your t-shirt or whatever. So you're mostly entitled to free speech, with a few exceptions. Exception one, as you well know, being in school. So not everything that you do in school is protected by the First Amendment. And then also, you have this idea of unprotected speech, and a few categories of that are obscenity, slander, or libel. Slander is spoken, libel is written, and slander and libel are, when you're speaking knowing falsehoods about somebody. It has to come with what's called actual malice. And again, I'm doing my air quotes and you can't see me, but you have to know that it's false, and you have to do it with an intention to harm somebody's reputation. So that's slander and libel. And then the other one, what did I say? Obscenity, libel, and slander in fighting words. So fighting words meaning like inciting a riot, essentially. You can't do that. However, it is interesting because people have been not held accountable for inciting riots because, just the speech on its own, and me saying, everybody go to the school with your pitchforks and burn it down. Like, that's a problem. I shouldn't say that. But unless you do it, I can't really be held liable for that in most instances. I mean, I'd probably lose my job because as a teacher, you're not supposed to say those things. But, and if I was like a normal person in normal society, then, maybe not. And I have a slide, it's later on in here. I should have put it right here though, after this is, the president's recent tweets, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota. And you can argue the president's inciting a riot, right? But until people are actually, in his name trying to stage a coup in Michigan, he probably will not be punished for that speech. And, nor should he be. And that's the thing, gosh, with the First Amendment right to freedom of expression, the thing that really is awful about it is that you have to believe that everybody is entitled to it, whether they're saying something that you like or not. And I think that's the hardest part about the interpretation of speech, is that it protects most thoughts, no matter how abhorrent you personally find them. All right, and then the most intervention on behalf of the government is physical actions. So certainly the government has the right to restrain speech if it's speech in a form of action, and meaning like you can't cause harm to other people via your expression. And if you guys remember Charlottesville a few years ago, I think it was the summer of 2018. And there was a, protests and counter protests and all this kind of stuff. And a guy ran his car into a woman who was protesting. And, he was part of the counter protest movement or vice versa. I can't actually remember who was the original protester in that, but one was a protester, one was a counter protester. And the one killed the other when he ran his car into her and, tried to defend himself by saying, well, he was, exercising his First Amendment right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly because he was, assembled trying to defend his beliefs and whatnot. And it's like, well, yeah, great. No, you can totally do that, except you can't run somebody over with your car. So there's that. All right. So prior restraint really deals with a lot of like newspaper publications. So, but we'll talk about it a little bit here in freedom of expression. Then we'll talk about it a little bit again in freedom of the press. But prior restraint is censorship, right? So in almost every single case, prior restraint is found unconstitutional, meaning that free societies don't censor things. There are several instances in which censorship has been upheld or prior restraint has been held. A lot of them involve direct cases of national security, which makes sense. Like if we are planning on, attacking a country and the press gets a hold of it and they publish the plans of attack before it happens, I mean, that's insane, right? So in that instance, like if the government were to get a hold of that information and say like, oh my gosh, the Washington Post is going to literally print a diagram of our attack plan 24 hours before we attack, then I believe in almost every instance, courts would say, yeah, no, you can't do that because it's going to cause undue harm to a lot of people, or it could. The other time where censorship is okay, and we don't have a school newspaper, but courts have upheld censorship in most school newspaper cases. Where I went to high school, we had a very active school newspaper. It was published weekly. It actually looked like a newspaper. It's called The Tower. It's won like national awards. It's a fantastic paper. But holy smokes, they write whatever the heck they want. And the principals that have, been in down the line since when I was there, way back in the 90s, have tried a couple of times to prevent something from being published. And then they have finally backed down because, I do believe probably in court they would have won, depending on what it was that was being censored. But usually what it had to do with was, policies that kids didn't like, or, the way that the school was handling something. And so the principal, acting sort of like the government would, was just trying to have something, like stop something from being published. It would make him look bad. So in that instance, you can't do that. But if it's like information that shouldn't be out to the public, then it's a different story. But again, prior restraint in almost all cases, unconstitutional. All right, first required case of the day. This is New York Times versus U.S. This is from 1971. And if you think, okay, what was going on around that time? Who was president? Most of our president cases that we have in here, of course, revolve around Nixon. And the subject of this one was the Vietnam War. And if you've seen the movie, and the Pentagon Papers, if you've seen the movie The Post, this is what this is about. And you're like, well, The Post, that's Washington Post. It is, but New York Times and Washington Post both were petitioners in this case. And so it was just named for the New York Times, although the movie was named for The Post. And really, Washington Post was the one that started it. But anyway, okay, so 1971. This is the Pentagon Papers case. I would expect that at some point in your study of U.S. history, you talked about the Pentagon Papers. It was a DoD, so Department of Defense study that was classified at the time. And it was basically went through all of the issues with Vietnam and how from the very beginning or very close to it, the U.S. government knew that there's absolutely no way that we would end up on the side of victory in the Vietnam War. And pretty much Vietnam would, fall to the communists. We wouldn't, we would not unite. We would not create a democratic society out of this, whatever. And so, it kept going through several presidents and through a couple of decades. So the Pentagon Papers, like I said, was a study about how, we should have ended this a long time ago. And Nixon, even though he was the last, well, that's not true. He was definitely not the first president to screw up in Vietnam, right? So, this isn't even necessarily about just him. It's about, all the decisions that have been made by him and presidents prior to him with respect to Vietnam. So the president, excuse me, I did not mean to yawn. President gets involved in this and, hears that the Pentagon Papers are going to be released, that the Washington Post is going to print them. So it was the New York Times. And the president argued that it was a matter of national security and they should not be published. And by asking the court to intervene and saying, do not allow this publication to publish this information, that is asking for the court to invoke censorship on this, okay, or prior restraint. So the president did argue that prior restraint was necessary because it was a case of national security. The constitutional question is, did the efforts by the president to stop what he deemed, classified information or matters of national security from being published, does it violate the First Amendment? And we would be looking at both the free expression clause and the freedom of the press here. But the ruling ended up for the New York Times, so for the papers, and allowed them to publish this information. And again, this is a per curiam ruling, which means that it's by the court. So nobody put their name on it. That does not necessarily mean that it was a unanimous opinion. What it means is it will never be known who voted which way. And a lot of times, again, I've said this before, when it's presidents that are involved in cases, it's a per curiam ruling. But their justification was, since the publication of the information would not cause an inevitable, direct, and immediate event imperiling the safety of American forces, prior restraint was unjustified. Again, this is the difference, like what I said before. If a newspaper wants to publish plans of attack, like future plans that are going to happen that could put troops in harm's way, that would be cause for prior restraint being invoked. This study was historical. And so by the president arguing national security, that was not a strong argument on his part, because all of the information that was in this study had already happened. And by the way, The Post is actually, it's a really good movie. You should watch it. All right. So the questions to consider when we talk about speech: what was said? Like I said, these like unprotected speech, so obscenities, libel, and fighting words. In what context was it said? Those are our time, place, and manner restrictions. Like time, place, and manner restrictions involve school. Time, place, and manner restrictions involve saying something that would create scary conditions for people, like the whole, you can't have fire in a crowded theater idea. In that case is actually coming up in a second, but that would be a time, place, and manner restriction. And then how is the government trying to regulate the speech? Are they trying to punish it after the fact, or are they trying to censor it before it comes out? And again, those are two totally different things. And the after the fact part is usually okay. And then the prior restraint is not, in very few cases. And then why are they trying to regulate? So are they interested in preserving the public peace, or are they interested in preventing criticism of people in power? And as you know, those are two completely different things. So we're looking at the good of the public versus the good of, re-election or something like that. All right, so some forms of protected speech. So political speech, as we know, is protected. We also know that political, like dollar contributions, is referred to as speech, or falls under that umbrella of speech or expression. A while ago, we talked about Buckley v. Vallejo, which was in 1976. And that was what established this idea that money equals speech. And then with Citizens United, that's the one that established, the corporations are people too. And, so that if individuals can contribute to campaigns monetarily, then so should corporations and unions be able to as well. Negative ads and all campaign events are protected as well. And if you remember, in the 2016 election, there are some campaign events that the president had where he was telling people within his events to become violent with reporters. And again, going back to that spectrum from before, you could argue, okay, that's inciting a riot. Like, you can't tell people to go after reporters and punch them. But you can, actually, because number one, it's a campaign event. Number two, nobody did. And again, like, you are punished differently if somebody acts on your words than you are if you just said them and they don't. Commercial speech, meaning like advertisements and commercials and stuff, are less protected. There's laws against things like false advertising and bait and switch. Bait and switch means like here you have this, like, we have this giant TV on sale for $100 and at Best Buy just this week only. And then you go in and it's like, oh, but it's actually, half the size and it's $400 or whatever. So it's bait and switch. All right. So we have 3 tests that we've used in, at some point during history. And none of them, I can't stop yawning. I apologize. None of them are applied like singularly anymore. But a lot of the precedents that we have in terms of expression cases are based on those. And the first is the bad tendency test, the clear and present danger test, and then the preferred position doctrine. And those kind of go in historical order there. So bad tendency, that was used up until the 1920s. And what it said was that it was reasonable for the government to forbid speech that would possibly corrupt society or possibly cause people to engage in crime. But what was found after a while was that was entirely too broad of a restriction on speech, especially the corrupting society part, because you're like corrupting on whose idea of morals. And that's the other issue that we see when we talk about obscenity too, is that what's obscene to one person is not to somebody else. So this idea of corrupting society is tough, because like you could argue that, I'm corrupting you by, speaking about, historical events and politicians and whatever else. All right. The clear and present danger test was used up through the 1950s. And what that said was that the government could restrict speech only if it presented an immediate danger to the public. This is where this case that we're going to talk about in a second, the Schenck case, was where the concept of, you can't yell fire in crowd of theater came from. It had nothing to do with theater or with fire. That part of it actually comes from the majority opinion that was written by, this is 1919. I want to say it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, might have been, but who wrote this majority opinion and said this would be akin to yelling fire in a crowded theater. So that's where this actually came from. This didn't come from, the case itself has absolutely nothing to do with a theater or with fire. So, but essentially what it means is that speech that leads to a riot, destruction, corruption of an election, or things that are tolerated in peacetime are not necessarily tolerated in wartime. And that essentially is actually what Schenck is about, because it had to do with things that he was saying during World War I. But again, speech leading to riot, destruction, corruption of election. So it has to happen in order for it to be punished. If I were to go into Sperry's when it opens again and everybody is back and crowding themselves, and I do yell fire and there is no fire, and people run out of the theater and a little kid gets trampled because of it, now I'm the one who's going to be charged with, inciting a riot, essentially. Okay, so here's a required case called Schenck versus U.S. This was in 1919. If you guys remember Hunter Delore, so he was in my class last year, and his mother's maiden name is spelled this way, but they pronounce it Schenck. And so when I put it up on the board and I said Schenck, he's like, "That's not right." And I'm like, "No, it is." And so yeah, nobody actually knows. Most people do pronounce it Schenck, but he told me it was Schenck. So whatever you want to say is fine. All right, so Charles Schenck, who was a self-proclaimed socialist, he was distributing leaflets. Remember, this was in 1919. Well, in 1918 it happened. The case came in 1919. So he was distributing leaflets declaring that the draft for World War I, the conscription, which really had just started for that war, violated the 13th Amendment, prohibition against involuntary servitude. Okay, so he's basically saying by making people join the military, that is akin to slavery. I mean, clearly it's not, right? For a whole lot of reasons. But anyway, so the leaflets urge the public to just disobey the draft entirely. And this is well before Vietnam, where you have people who are, protesting and burning their draft cards and, like, and that sort of thing. Like, this was not a time in which you protested the government in that way, back in the early 1900s. So Schenck was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act of 1917. Espionage typically meaning spying. But they used that one because they said he was attempting to cause insubordination in the military. So basically, and obstruct recruitment. Like that one was obvious, right? Like he was like passing out leaflets that say don't join up. This is slavery. And then, but the insubordination within the military, the thought was that if military personnel got a hold of the information that he was saying, that they would just up and leave, or riot or what have you. So Schenck was convicted of violating that law, and then he appealed. So the constitutional question was, did Schenck's conviction for criticizing the draft violate his First Amendment right to freedom of speech? And I feel like you could very easily argue that, yes, it absolutely violated his First Amendment right to freedom of speech. I can criticize the draft all I want. I can like throw some stuff on. So I mean, we don't have a draft anymore, but whatever. If we did, like, I could throw some stuff on social media. I could do a direct mailing. I mean, there are things that are so much worse that people criticize the government for now. But here's the thing: the ruling in this case was unanimous for the U.S. And this is the argument that the First Amendment does not protect speech that approaches creating a clear and present danger of a significant evil. And the court believed that if enough people got a hold of these leaflets, so this widespread dissemination, that it would really disrupt the draft process. So they thought that this guy would have entirely too much influence on this if, this idea became widespread, and that it would create a clear and present danger to society because we wouldn't have enough people fighting in World War I. Okay, it's a stretch. Like, this case is a stretch, but again, it's back in 1919, and this is, I was right. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes. This, in his opinion, the majority opinion he wrote for the court, he compared the leaflets to shouting "fire" in a crowded theater. So again, that's where this comes up. So if Schenck ever appears on a test somewhere, you don't want to say, so Charles Schenck yelled "fire" in a crowded theater, and you can't do that. Okay, that's not what the case is about. The significance of this case was that it was the first existence of that clear and present danger test, which is no longer applied, but that's okay. All right, so now we have the preferred position doctrine. So it takes from clear and present danger to imminent lawless action. So the courts, like later on, starting in after the 1950s, began to look at the Schenck case and say, well, I don't know that something like distributing leaflets that would maybe cause people to not join up in the military. I'm not really sure that in and of itself is presenting a clear and present danger. And so it's this idea that like your speech has to directly lead to imminent and lawless action. And it has to create it. And so like the fire in a crowded theater part actually would create imminent lawless action. So what Holmes suggested it was akin to would be imminent lawless action. But what actually happened in the Schenck case was not imminent lawless action. So all right, so Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is not a required case, but it's a very interesting case. It was in 1969. So it was about the Ku Klux Klan, excuse me. And it was like a series of KKK rallies and meetings and, just assembled, that sort of thing. And it was brought, the state of Ohio was trying to make it so that a KKK rally could not be held. This happened in Illinois too, and I don't remember the name of the case, but they're essentially trying to say, like, we don't want that here because it's going to incite violence. It is going to create a clear and present danger. And what the court found, and again, like, think about how tough it is to be a Supreme Court justice, because there is not one justice on that Supreme Court then or now, or probably, hopefully ever, in the modern court anyway, who would have been a supporter of the KKK. And to have to rule for them has to be like gut wrenching, right? But again, if you're following the Constitution and you're following precedent, or in this case, setting new precedent, what they believed is that the state of Ohio could not prove that the KKK incited the violence that followed from their teachings at these meetings or rallies or what have you. And that if the government is going to take any action against the KKK, it has to be on actions only. Remember that spectrum in the very beginning of this, where, speech or your belief is like not intervening at all, but actions are, the most amount of intervention. That's it right here. So if the KKK was allowed to hold that rally, which they were, and then, their speech, they said, everybody, go burn down, 6 houses, and people did it. Now that you can not only take the people to court who actually burned the places down, but you could take the KKK to court too for creating imminent lawless action. So what came out of this case is this idea that freedom of expression is so essential to democracy that the government should only punish people for what they do, not what they say. And that's a good point. So, like, this is why you have to put up with all of these opposing sides on social media, because, like, unless you're going to go do something about it and, and create societal harm, you can pretty much say whatever you want. Here it is. Okay. So this is what I was talking about in the very beginning. It's a series of tweets that happened in pretty quick succession last week, or possibly, it was last week. So as we know, there's, the stay-at-home orders are happening throughout different states, and there really is no, like, federal level support for them or against them, and really nor should there be, because every state is dealing with this differently. So I don't think that the federal government should say, okay, the entire country's on lockdown. That doesn't make sense if you live in, like, Montana, right? But so, like, a lot of leeway has been given to the governors of the states to figure out, okay, what's best for your state. And as we know, and we talked about this last week in our Zoom meeting, that people are a little bit up in arms about, what some of the things that are that are put into the stay-at-home order, like, the boating thing and golfing, and that kind of stuff. And I mean, there's some valid points to, like, okay, why can we sell lottery tickets and liquor, but you can't sell, but Meyer can't sell garden plants or whatever. So, like, I'm not saying that it's without merit, but and it probably does deserve a little bit more explanation as to, why this and why not that. Especially, well, it doesn't matter. Okay. But when you look at the president, who has said repeatedly, well, first he claimed he had full authority, but then later on walked that back and said, this is really up to the states. Like, they need to do what's best for their state. Then to go on to Twitter, once he sees, all of these protests that are happening in these different states. And, if you look at pictures of those protests, most of them are carrying signs or a lot of them are carrying Trump signs. So he knows that like these are his people. So he takes to Twitter and yells out, "Liberate Minnesota, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, and save your great Second Amendment. It is under siege." Okay, no, it's not. But there's a Second Amendment rally that was going to take place in Virginia. That's why that one is specific. And if you watch what has happened since then, the ramping up of protests against stay-at-home orders has been happening all throughout the country. There's very famously, and I swear to you, it's going to be in a textbook one day, a picture of a nurse standing in the street with his mask on and like his scrubs, blocking a car from continuing to protest. And, you know, a woman carrying her sign out of her truck that I think said land of the free or something like that. And literally like shouting at him, like, get out of the, you know, this isn't fair, whatever. And, you know, it's so if you look at these tweets, you could argue very easily that they're inciting a riot. Now, had something violent happen, now first of all, Liberate Michigan happened after the protest last week anyway. But let's say he writes Liberate Virginia, and then they go to their Second Amendment rally. And of course, at a Second Amendment rally, you can imagine, I would imagine most people are carrying guns. And let's say people just open fire. Okay. Again, now you are talking about actions based off of speech. And so if you could prove a connection to, like if the guy who opened fire said, "My president said I need to liberate Virginia." Okay, now we're proving that, you know, that the words incited the violence. In Michigan, if, you know, people stormed the Capitol again, or stormed Lansing again and tried to stage a coup against Governor Whitmer, they did it, and they say that they did it in the name of their president's tweet, then yeah, again, you can argue that's inciting violence. But until it reaches that point, it would not be. All right, I think that is good for this one because I've been talking for like a really long time. So we'll get into other forms of protected speech next time. So let me find this and goodbye.